In 1995, newspapers across America received a chilling message. Publish my manifesto, or I will blow up a passenger airplane. For nearly 18 years, the FBI had been hunting the man behind a series of mysterious bombings that had left multiple people dead and many others permanently injured. They had thousands of leads. Millions of dollars had been spent. And yet, they still had no idea who he was. The man responsible became known as the Unabomber, one of the most wanted criminals in the United States. But what made this case so unusual wasn't just the violence, it was the man behind it. Because before he became the target of one of the largest manhunts in FBI history, he had been something very different: a child prodigy, a Harvard student, a gifted mathematician, and by all accounts, someone with a brilliant future ahead of him. So, how did a man with an IQ of around 167 end up living alone in a tiny cabin in the Montana wilderness, building bombs that would terrorize America for nearly 2 decades? This is the story of Ted Kaczynski, the man the world would come to know as the Unabomber. To understand how he got there, we need to go back to the beginning. The story begins on May 22, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. Ted Kaczynski was born into what appeared to be an ordinary American family. Nothing about his childhood suggested that he would one day become the target of one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. But from an early age, one thing became impossible to ignore. Ted was exceptionally intelligent. His teachers quickly realized that he learned much faster than the other children around him. He skipped grades, consistently achieved outstanding results, and developed an extraordinary talent for mathematics. While many children spent their afternoons playing with friends, Ted often preferred reading, studying, and solving complex mathematical problems on his own. His intelligence earned him respect, but it also made him different. By the age of 16, Ted had been accepted into Harvard University. It was an extraordinary achievement. For most people, getting into Harvard is difficult enough. Ted managed to do it while he was still only 16 years old. His future seemed incredibly promising. At Harvard, however, life wasn't as easy as his academic success suggested. Because he was much younger than many of the other students, Ted struggled socially. He was quiet, reserved, and often kept to himself. Although he excelled academically, he never truly seemed to fit in. After graduating from Harvard, Ted continued studying mathematics and eventually earned a doctorate. His remarkable talent soon opened another extraordinary door. In 1967, at just 25 years old, he became an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley. For someone so young, it was an achievement that very few people ever reach. It looked as though Ted Kaczynski was on his way to an exceptional academic career. But only 2 years later, in 1969, he made a decision that surprised the people around him. He resigned from Berkeley. He offered very little explanation. A brilliant mathematician simply walked away from one of the most respected universities in the United States. Over the next couple of years, Ted drifted between different jobs while becoming increasingly frustrated with modern society and the direction he believed it was heading. Then, in 1971, he made another life-changing decision. He moved to a tiny hand-built cabin near Lincoln, Montana. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, no modern comforts. It was isolated, deep in the wilderness. For Ted, this wasn't an escape. It was the beginning of an entirely different life. At first, Ted believed he had found the answer. If modern society was the problem, then the solution seemed simple. leave it behind. The further he distanced himself from civilization, the more convinced he became that technology wasn't improving people's lives. In his eyes, every new invention made humanity a little less independent. People relied on machines, governments, large organizations, and systems that seemed to grow more powerful every year. Ted wanted no part of it. Living alone gave him plenty of time to think. Day after day, he filled notebooks with his thoughts about technology, freedom, and the future of society. Over time, those thoughts became stronger, more rigid, and far more dangerous. Ted eventually convinced himself that writing about his beliefs wasn't enough. He believed that no one would ever listen to his ideas unless he forced the world to pay attention. It was a decision that would change not only his own life, but the lives of countless others. In May of 1978, nearly 7 years after moving to Montana, that belief took its first violent step. A suspicious package was discovered at the University of Illinois in Chicago. No one could have imagined that it was only the beginning. At first, investigators believed it was an isolated incident, a homemade bomb hidden inside a package. Strange, but not enough to suggest that a serial bomber was on the loose. The explosion injured a university security officer, but there were very few clues pointing to whoever had built the device. The bomb itself was crude, handmade, carefully constructed from ordinary materials. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no obvious motive. For months, the investigation went nowhere. Then it happened again. Another package, another bomb, and then another. As the attacks continued over the following years, investigators slowly realized they weren't dealing with random acts of violence. Someone was carefully choosing their targets: universities, professors, researchers, people connected to technology and scientific progress. But why? Whoever was responsible seemed to be sending a message. The problem was, no one knew what that message was, and with every new attack, the mystery only grew deeper. With every new attack, the pressure on investigators continued to grow. The victims seemed to have little in common at first, but as the FBI looked closer, a pattern slowly began to emerge. Many of the targets were connected to universities. Others had ties to the airline industry. It wasn't enough to identify the bomber, but it was enough to give the investigation a name. Inside the FBI, the case became known as Unabomber, short for University and Airline Bomber. Before long, the media transformed that name into something the entire country would recognize: the Unabomber. As the years passed, the attacks became more sophisticated. The bombs were carefully built by hand, each one slightly different from the last, almost as if the bomber was learning from every previous explosion. Despite one of the largest investigations in FBI history, investigators still had no suspect, no reliable witness, no clear motive. It was as though the bomber had vanished without leaving a trace. By the early 1990s, fear had spread far beyond university campuses. No one knew where the next package would appear, or who would open it. For nearly 18 years, the attacks continued. Sometimes months would pass without incident. Then, without warning, another bomb would appear. The pattern was impossible to predict. No phone calls, no demands, no claim of responsibility, just carefully constructed explosive devices arriving without explanation. The man behind them seemed content to remain completely anonymous until 1995. After years of silence, the bomber finally decided to speak. Not to the FBI, not to the victims, but to the American media. In a letter sent to several major newspapers, he delivered an ultimatum: publish my manifesto, or I will blow up a passenger airplane." For the first time, the mysterious bomber wasn't trying to hide. He wanted the entire world to hear what he had to say. The demand placed the authorities in an impossible position. If the newspapers agreed to publish the manifesto, they would be giving a serial bomber exactly what he wanted. But if they refused, there was a real possibility that another innocent person would die. For weeks, government officials, investigators, and newspaper editors debated what to do. It wasn't just a legal decision, it was an ethical one. Should the media give a platform to a man responsible for years of violence, if it might save lives? Eventually, the decision was made. In September 1995, the New York Times and the Washington Post published the manifesto in full. It was more than 35,000 words long. The FBI hoped that somewhere, someone would recognize the person behind those words. It was a long shot, but after nearly 2 decades without a suspect, they were running out of options. The FBI's gamble had finally paid off. Not because someone recognized the bomber's face, but because someone recognized his words. One of the people who read the manifesto was David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother. As he continued reading, certain phrases immediately stood out. The writing style, the arguments, even specific expressions. They all reminded him of letters Ted had written over the years. At first, David desperately hoped he was wrong. But the more he compared the manifesto with Ted's old letters, the harder it became to ignore the similarities. Faced with an impossible decision, David contacted an attorney. Together, they turned Ted's letters over to the FBI. For investigators, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting for nearly 2 decades. The letters gave investigators something they had never truly had before: a suspect. After comparing Ted's writing with the manifesto, the FBI became convinced they were looking at the right man. In early April 1996, agents traveled to a remote cabin near Lincoln, Montana. For years, that tiny cabin had remained hidden among the trees. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Nothing about it suggested that it belonged to one of America's most wanted men. On April 3, 1996, FBI agents arrested Ted Kaczynski without incident. He didn't run. He didn't resist. But what investigators found inside the cabin shocked them. The small wooden cabin was filled with journals, handwritten notes, bomb-making materials, and an unfinished explosive device. For nearly 2 decades, Ted had carefully documented his thoughts, his plans, and many details of his bombing campaign. After 18 years, one of the longest and most expensive investigations in FBI history had finally come to an end. With Ted Kaczynski in custody, the bombing campaign that had terrorized America for nearly 2 decades was finally over. Federal prosecutors prepared a case that could have resulted in the death penalty. But before the trial began, Ted agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for admitting responsibility for the bombings, he received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. For the families of the victims, the conviction brought an end to a case that had lasted nearly 18 years. But it didn't answer every question. How could someone with extraordinary intelligence, a Harvard graduate, a gifted mathematician, and a respected university professor, choose a path that ended in violence instead of achievement? Ted Kaczynski died in prison on June 10, 2023, at the age of 81. Even though Ted Kaczynski is gone, the impact of his crimes can still be felt across the United States. The Unabomber case changed the way law enforcement investigated domestic terrorism and mail bombings. and it remains one of the most infamous criminal investigations in American history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to Whisper Hollow for more true stories.